Hey, RetconRaider here. Today's video is dedicated to Ash and Woe77. Thanks for your support, guys. That said, let's get started. Well, here we are in August, and I'm happy to say that the devs over at Snapshot Games have finally opened the floodgates. Obviously, things were pretty slow for a while, at least for us, the outside observers. No news, no teasers, no significant information at all for almost 6 months straight. Thankfully, that all seems to have changed now that we're past E3 and officially moving into the final stretch. Sadly, the official development roadmap has all but been abandoned at this point, at least from our point of view. However, one of the developers did recently reveal that they are actually still using the roadmap. It's just been converted for in-house use to help keep their ever-expanding team properly coordinated. Now, first up, we've got the obvious. The third and, hopefully, final delay. Back at E3, Snapshot made waves by announcing a rather ambitious release date, with Backer Build 5 coming out in early August, and the game's full launch slated for September 3rd. I think it's safe to say that a lot of us were pretty skeptical about that announcement, especially when it came to light that, in order to actually meet that target, they would probably end up launching an unfinished game. Skip to 1 month later, and surprising pretty much no one, Kevin Hill has now announced that the game will not actually be ready to hit that target. Instead, it's been delayed another full 3 months, until sometime in December. Assuming that's the final delay, that will put the game's eventual launch date roughly 1 full year behind schedule. Speaking of which, Build 5 has also been pushed back, though not nearly as dramatically as the game's full launch. Instead of hitting the original target in August, Backer Build 5 will now be coming out on September 3rd, exactly 1 month from now, and about 3 months from the game's new planned release date. Based on what we've heard, the new build will include several of the currently unimplemented mechanics, such as base building, diplomacy and trading, research and development, new weapons and equipment, new mission types, and pretty much all of the planned NPC factions. What it won't include, however, are a lot of the less vital systems, such as the full character customization system, possibly including female character models. Similarly, while they have started work on the game's full audio, Build 5 is unlikely to include things like the game's full soundtrack or properly recorded and polished soldier barks. Many of the implemented mechanics will still be unfinished and rough around the edges, and at least a few placeholders are likely to still be in place. They'll also be deliberately withholding any content that might spoil the overarching story, including the planned tutorials. Unfortunately, that's just the sort of thing that we'll have to wait until December to actually see. All things considered, it's actually starting to sound like Backer Build 5 is the closest thing we'll be getting to an actual backer beta. That is to say, a version of the game that is basically feature complete, but not quite content complete. It should be sufficient to give us a much better idea of what the final game will be like, essentially showcasing the framework of the overall game's design, but without spoiling the final product. That actually brings us to the 2 official news updates that we got back in July, both of which focus on content that has been confirmed for Backer Build 5. The first of these updates, released on July 13th, actually showcases Sanhedrin, one of the factions we've heard a lot about, but have seen very little of so far. They were originally pitched as having a distinctly retro-futuristic appearance, complete with things like bulky clean suits, giant swords, and overly clunky energy weapons with lots of awkward protrusions. The new batch of teaser art, however, showcases a much sleeker, modern-looking faction, making it abundantly clear that they've gone through some pretty significant changes. This is actually a recurring theme throughout most of the official update. For example, we obviously have the Infiltrator, Sanhedrin's unique elite class, which has gone through some rather significant changes over the past 12 months alone. According to the official update, it sounds like the Infiltrator's unique armor will provide them with significant stealth bonuses on the battlefield. This will allow them to act as spotters, scouts, or to ambush unsuspecting enemies. However, these bonuses will not come without a cost. In this case, essentially removing the Infiltrator's ability to use the normal inventory system. Instead, it sounds like they'll be restricted to just using the 3 ready slots, meaning they'll only be able to equip 1 primary weapon and 2 secondary or utility items. This is actually reflected in the new pieces of specialized equipment that were also included in the official update. The original pitch for the Infiltrator, for example, mentioned that they could use things like silenced crossbows or proximity-triggered explosives, both of which appear to have been combined into a new multi-purpose mine launcher, which will likely use the Infiltrator's primary ready slot. Similarly, the original pitch also mentioned that some Infiltrators could use special drone hive backpacks, allowing them to remotely scout an area, something which has evolved into a multi-purpose dog drone, which can also be worn on the Infiltrator's back. This update even mentions that, much like the mine launcher, this new backpack drone is also multi-purpose, and can be reconfigured between missions to serve very different functions on the battlefield. Perhaps a little more surprising is the recent reveal that Sanhedrin will also be getting access to their very own version of the basic Assault class. While we long knew that Sanhedrin would have their own version of the Sniper class, it was generally accepted they wouldn't make use of frontline classes like the Assault or Heavy. Instead, they would focus on stealth and mobility on the battlefield, harassing their opponents with drones and ranged attacks, rather than facing them head-on. Combined with the other recent rumors that Sanhedrin will also be getting access to the Technician class, as well as their own unique ground-based combat vehicle, it's starting to sound like they're going to have a much more conventional presence on the battlefield. They'll essentially be fielding a force very similar to the one used by New Jericho, but with energy weapons instead of Gauss weapons, and the Elite Infiltrator class instead of New Jericho's Elite Heavy. This actually runs parallel to what we already know about the Disciples of Anu. We were generally operating under the assumption that they would only have access to the basic Heavy class, which would then be supplemented by 3 additional elite classes, the Berserker, the Priest, and the Mutog Handler. As of the official update from July 29th, however, we now know that the class list for the Disciples has officially changed. Most notably, just like with Sanhedrin, the Disciples will now have access to the basic Assault class as well. Unfortunately, this does appear to come at a cost, with the previously planned Mutog Handler apparently being cut. Although this does mean that the Disciples of Anu now have access to 2 basic classes, they're still set apart from the other factions by their unique mutation system, something which was actually showcased in the latest official update. These images include what appears to be a mutated Heavy, a mutated Assault, and a partially mutated Sniper. That last one is rather intriguing, given that we know the Disciples don't actually have access to snipers. As with pretty much everything else, we're still pretty hazy on the details of how all this will work. But at the moment, it sounds like mutations will be broken up into 3 rough categories: leg mutations, arm and torso mutations, and head mutations, basically matching up with the 3 armor slots. This makes sense, given that one of the known drawbacks of these mutations is the inability to wear armor on a mutated location. It's also worth noting that the developers are currently planning to limit us to just 2 mutations per soldier, though that's something that could certainly end up changing. It's also worth noting that, unlike most of the other classes in the game, the two elite Disciple classes are apparently reliant on the player taking very specific mutations. The Priest class, for example, requires a soldier to select from a specific category of head mutations. There are actually multiple choices in that category, with each one resulting in a slightly different subclass, but it's impossible to select the Priest class if the player isn't willing to mutate their soldiers. Based on the player's choice of mutations, it sounds like the Priest will actually have access to a fairly wide assortment of special powers. This prominently includes the ability to control Mutogs, essentially absorbing the function of the now-cut Mutog handler, while also further expanding the ability by allowing the Priest to also control weak-willed opponents. Other possible mutations include things like detecting hidden enemies, cloaking their allies from view, emitting a psychic blast that injures all nearby enemies, or even absorbing the mist, converting it into extra will points. The Berserker, on the other hand, is a little more mysterious. Although we don't know if it requires a specific mutation, like the Priest does, we do know that they will have access to special combat-based mutations. Although they do overlap with the Disciple's Assault class, their abilities seem much more focused on short-range and close-quarters combat. For example, they specialize in using melee weapons and heavy handguns, which they can use to not only strip or destroy an opponent's armor, but also to deliberately infect their targets. Their special abilities are also geared towards brutal, close-ranged combat, with their most basic ability allowing them to automatically retaliate whenever a nearby opponent takes an action. Other special abilities include things like Bloodlust, which grants them extra will points when inflicting or receiving melee damage, as well as a powerful triple melee strike, which is thematically similar to some of the other classes' capstone abilities. Beyond that, the rest of the chatter from June and July has actually revolved around things like campaign length, difficulty, and even replayability. Now, obviously, this is all stuff that won't really be relevant until December, but it still made for some pretty fascinating reading. For example, during a recent interview, Julian Gollop stated that the game's main campaign will take roughly 30 hours to beat. However, he stressed that this would be heavily influenced by the player's performance. After all, Phoenix Point revolves around the concept of an enemy that evolves in response to the player's strategies. If the player happens to be struggling, then the aliens will likewise have less incentive to continue evolving, essentially providing a built-in mechanic to help give the player some extra breathing room if they start to flounder. However, Julian also stressed that the player will not be able to continue playing indefinitely. The Pandora virus does have an ultimate goal, and if the player drags their feet too much, then eventually that goal will be accomplished. If that ends up happening, then that's it. The virus is won and the campaign is over. It's up to the player to find the perfect balance, giving themselves adequate time to prepare for the final confrontation, but without taking so long that it's actually too late to save the human race. Snapshot's QA lead later expanded on this over on Reddit. He explained that it is actually possible to delay the endgame, but that it's tricky and requires a lot of luck. You're also really just delaying the inevitable, and eventually you will have to confront the virus. Win or lose, the campaign will then be over. Though he did acknowledge that there's a chance they might end up adding some sort of endless sandbox mode as post-launch content. In the short term, though, the developers are just more focused on providing a medium-length campaign with a high amount of replay value. The game will include 4 distinct endings, 5 if you count the lose condition, and the early gameplay will change significantly depending on the player's starting location, as well as the procedurally generated world that they load into. He also spent some time talking about the game's planned difficulty curve, specifically noting that Build 4 was not representative of the game's intended balance. Rather, the developers are going for a game where the player will be constantly struggling to keep their soldiers properly fed and equipped. There will, of course, be difficulty options to help fine-tune an individual player's experience, but he stressed that they were trying to avoid the inverse difficulty curve seen in games like XCOM 2. Much as Julian stated in his recent interview, the threats in the world of Phoenix Point will escalate right alongside the player's power level. That's not to say that there will be a one-to-one level scaling sort of situation, but more that the game will have built-in contingencies to better accommodate how well or how poorly the player happens to be doing. By way of example, in another interview, Julian Gollop reiterated that soldiers in the world of Phoenix Point won't be quite as fragile as they were in the original XCOM trilogy. Falling in battle won't necessarily equate to automatic death, but may instead result in a soldier being crippled or otherwise mentally scarred. This is something that might hurt them in the short term, but could very well end up resulting in a stronger or more interesting soldier in the long term, whether through the use of cybernetic limbs, strange mutations, or even just good old-fashioned combat drugs. Personally, as a longtime dungeon master, that's actually something that I find very appealing. Anyway, that pretty much covers everything we learned about Phoenix Point throughout the month of July. Given that we're just 1 month away from the launch of Backer Build 5, it's probably safe to assume that we'll be hearing a lot more about the game over the next few weeks. Like I said, it is a little disappointing to get hit with yet another delay, especially one so close to the second target release date. Still, all things considered, I do think that this will result in a better overall game. And hey, at least this gives me a little more time to finish analyzing the lore. That said, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the official YouTube channel, the official Discord server, the official Facebook page, the official Twitter feed, the official development roadmap, or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. As always, links are in the description.